Revolutions Per Minute is a weekly radio show from the New York City chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America, recorded live at WBAI 99.5 in Brooklyn every Tuesday at 5. RPM is about doing the work to build a democratic socialist future. Every week, hear the latest news, analysis, and organizing experience from the minds and hearts of activists fighting every day in NYC. Join the movement at socialists.nyc.
You're listening to Revolutions Per Minute on WBAI, a socialist radio show and podcast from members of the New York City Democratic Socialists of America. I'm Lee Zishi, and I use she, her pronouns. And today we're going to be talking about the Climate and Community Protections Act and how it's been renamed. So for years, a broad coalition of New Yorkers have been organizing to pass the CCPA, the most ambitious and far-reaching climate bill in the country. In the last several days, there's been a lot of negotiation going on. We'll get all into that. And the legislation has been renamed by Governor Cuomo in the last couple of days as the Climate Leadership and Communities Protection Act. So we're going to talk about what this bill has been based on, the years and years of organizing that have gone into it. But first, we're going to go to the headlines with Jack Devine.
Yo, what's good, New York? This is Jack Devine with Revolutions Per Minute's headlines, brought to you by The Thorn. You can read more from The Thorn at thethorn.nyc. This week, we have a special in-depth review of New York's judicial elections. How do they work? Check it out at thethorn.nyc. In a monumental victory for the housing justice movement, New York State passed a major tenant protection bill that ends vacancy deregulation of rent-stabilized units, significantly decreases the ability of landlords to raise rent after making capital improvements on rent-regulated apartments, legalizes rent control outside of New York City, and much more. The bill also includes some protections for market-rate tenants. After dominating state politics for decades, New York's real estate industry has been shook by the growing might of organized tenant power. After experiencing their first serious legislative defeat in a generation, real estate barons are threatening to sue the state. Banks that derive profits from financing landlords who deregulate stabilized units are already reporting losses. Some may even have to sacrifice one of their 10 vacation homes. However, the struggle for socialized housing has only just begun. The final renter protection compromise did not contain the most radical proposal that housing activists have been pushing for: the Good Cause Eviction Bill, crafted by DSA member and state senator Julia Salazar, which would have extended significant protections to unstabilized units. Housing organizers intend to fight for this proposal and other reforms to protect unregulated tenants in future legislative sessions, now that the entire rent control package will not sunset every 4 years. After nearly a 2-decade struggle by immigrant justice activists, New York State passed the Green Light Bill, which enables undocumented immigrants to receive state-issued driver's licenses. Additionally, the New York State Assembly, Senate, and Governor Cuomo have reached an agreement to pass the Climate and Community Protection Act. You'll hear more about this legislation and the broader fight for eco-socialism throughout today's episode. With the 2019 legislative session concluding this Wednesday, organizers are pushing lawmakers to pass a number of progressive bills, including marijuana legalization, police reform, as well as the Protect Our Courts Act, which exempts people from civil arrest based on immigration status while involved in court proceedings. Layleen Polanco, a transgender woman who was tortured to death in solitary confinement on Rikers Island last week, spent 8 days in the hospital just 2 weeks before being held in punitive isolation. Just days after her death, another detainee, Jose Rivera, also died on Rikers Island. Strikes continue to spread across multiple sectors of the U.S. economy. Yesterday in New York and other American cities, hundreds of BuzzFeed workers walked off the job to demand that BuzzFeed management recognize their union. Meanwhile, today, Prospect workers at the Denver airport are on strike over health and safety on the job. In international news, millions of workers across Brazil launched a general strike against Bolsonaro's fascist regime and its plan for pension reforms. The action paralyzed cities across the country, demonstrating the illegitimacy of the government and the power of an organized working class. Also in South America, Tens of thousands of Chilean teachers have been on strike for weeks to fight back against the assault on public education. Solidarity with workers and people everywhere fighting for a better world. Now back to Lee on the fight for climate justice here in New York.
And before we dig into the CCPA, which has been renamed since Jack even recorded these headlines, we're going to have an update from the organizing that's happening on the ground in Queens for the Caban DA race that DSA is working hard on from Kyle Sorrell. So here's an update on the Caban for Queens campaign.
5 months, DSA and dozens of left organizations have given incredible organizing power to the Caban campaign for Queens District Attorney. Thousands of volunteer hours, tens of thousands of dollars, and long days canvassing in every neighborhood in Queens. We entered this race knowing that it would be a fight unlike any we've faced before. Queens is a massive borough of 2.3 million people with entrenched politicians and vengeful capitalist interests. But we also knew that the reward would be worth it. Queens District Attorney is the executive seat of its mass incarceration system, and if held by a decarceral working-class public defender, its power to stop state violence against working people, especially our black and brown communities ravaged by police and prisons, would be immediate and utterly transformative. The stakes could not be higher, and lucky for us, we couldn't have asked for a better candidate. Tiffany has been on her feet every single day for years, as a lawyer representing poor people, and now a leader in the national movement towards restorative justice and decarceration. You know what? Just listen to her.
If you have money, if you know how to game the system, you can do whatever you want in the city. If you're a person of color, you're poor, you're an immigrant, no one's on your side. People like us are exactly who the system is trying to keep down. That's why I became a public defender. I'm running for district attorney of Queens to bring justice to working people. But the corrupt Queens political machine doesn't want me to win. Your next DA could be a career politician or a career prosecutor, or your next DA could be a public defender. Who do you trust?
This week, in the next 7 days, we have the opportunity to improve the lives of millions of people. Beyond that, we'll show the elite class that it's the people that are in charge in New York City, and our movement will grow even stronger. If you're listening, if you or your loved ones have ever been affected by mass incarceration and you want to do something about it, this is your chance. Go to bit.ly/CabanGOTV and join this fight.
Our daily headlines are brought to you by The Thorn, an incredible weekly newsletter by New York City DSA Electoral Worker Group covering local politics and radical activism. Subscribe at thethorn.nyc. And so this is Lee Zishi again. I use she, her pronouns. And today we're talking about the bill formerly known as the CCPA. And I'm joined in the studio today by Ryan Madden, who's a climate organizer. I know him through the Energy Democracy Alliance, where we really fight to kind of own our own energy. Welcome, Ryan.
Yeah,
thanks
happy
for
to be
being
here.
on. Can you tell people a little bit about, your background in organizing and what you've been doing around the CCPA?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Ryan Madden. I use he, him pronouns. I've been organizing around climate issues for 7 years, starting with community-based energy efficiency work. Spent a couple weeks at the UN, a couple years before Paris with the youth delegation, organizing alongside civil society delegation across the world, including solidarity campaigns with the Philippines in the aftermath of Typhoon Haiyan. And for the last couple of years, I've served as the sustainability organizer for the Long Island Progressive Coalition, which is a core member of New Yorker News. And I am also part of Sunrise Movement, the hub here in New York City and on Long Island. And today I'm not representing any of those organizations, just myself, climate organizer in various spaces. But again, for the last 3.5 years, I've really been working deeply on Long Island, building a base of support in key Senate districts in the New York State Senate to further the aims of the Climate and Community Protection Act.
I think I saw you too in some Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez literature. Your picture was on there.
Yes, I did sneak my way into that. Another organization I commune with is a group called Muslims for Progress. And Right Time, Right Place last year, they were like, hey, we want to make this GOTV video for this candidate, Alexandria. And I was like, sure, I know people who know how to do that. That picture is from a film shoot that we did do a GOTV video for the Bengali communities in Jackson Heights in the Bronx.
Well, I'm really excited that you're on today, and we're going to really get to dig into about, what climate justice, what has been happening in New York the last couple of years, what can happen. And you're listening to Revolutions Per Minute on listener-sponsored WBAI in New York City, broadcasting at 99.5 FM and streaming on your favorite podcast app. To connect with us after the show, you can email us at revolutionsnyc@gmail.com or sign up for our newsletter to get what we talk about. You can also listen to this episode on revolutionsperminute.simplecast.com. And so today we are talking about a bill that New Yorkers have been organizing for many years that was formerly called the Climate and Community Protection Act. We're joined by Ryan Madden. So Ryan, just kind of to start off, what is, people call this the CCPA. It's kind of got a new name now, but this bill that people have been organizing on for years, the CCPA, what is it all about?
Yeah, and I'm going to talk about it as it was envisioned and what the plan for this bill was, and then we can get into what Albany has done to it later on. But the Climate and Community Protection Act was really a standard bearer for the most aggressive climate equity legislation in the entire country. It would set into law economy-wide emission reduction mandates, so we would get to zero emissions of greenhouse gas emissions in all sectors of the economy, not just electricity, but transportation, housing, heating, cooling, manufacturing. So it would get us to zero emissions by 2050 with a pathway to 100% renewable energy. It would invest 40% of all state climate funds into historically disadvantaged communities, environmental justice communities, predominantly low-income communities and communities of color who have borne the brunt of fossil fuel extraction and burning and digging and dumping, and then it would have set labor standards for any state-funded energy project to ensure that there were prevailing wage and other labor standards to ensure good family-supporting jobs in the green economy.
And so there's been this coalition, New York Renews, that have been organizing on this for a long time. Kind of who makes up New York Renews? Yeah,
so New York Renews came into existence in the aftermath of the 2014 People's Climate March, where all of the organizations that came together around that, the intentionality of, who was at the front of the line and what messages were being uplifted, the kind of intentions that went into then forming a statewide coalition to fight for transformative climate policy. And so the real anchors of the coalition have been members of the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, People's Climate Movement, NYC, environmental advocates, Sierra Club, People United for Sustainable Housing, Push Buffalo, Citizen Action of New York, and union allies like 32BJ, the Nurses Union, Green Faith. A real large coalition of labor, community, faith, and environmental justice organizations coming together around this holistic platform, understanding that you can challenge and address issues of economic inequality and structural racism with the same climate policies. And that's really where the Climate and Community Protection Act was born out of, a very intentional statewide listening tour of communities, organizations that have been doing this work for decades about what does your community need to thrive and how do we reflect that in comprehensive climate legislation.
And yeah, you're saying these are groups that have been doing this work for a very long time, but a lot of times these aren't the faces of environmentalism, especially when you look at some of these bigger organizations. They tend to be very white or labor is not included. But this coalition has had all of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a product of decades of movement knitting. Traditional environmental organizations like the Bigger Greens, like Sierra Club coming to the table and really centering equity and frontline leadership, abiding by the Jemez principles of democratic organizing to, again, explicitly uplift, center, and commit to the narratives and perspectives of people who are most impacted by these issues. People closest to the problem are closest to solutions, but usually the furthest away from power. And by abiding by these principles, we've been able to bring together this incredible coalition of people that have equity and community-led solutions at the center of everything that we do. So it's been really encouraging to see and just be a part of something that has literally been decades in the making, and decades of trust building, relationship building, coalition organizing. So it's a really incredible product of what, just social movements.
Yeah, and so this is like decades of organizing, and we're in this moment kind of standing on the shoulders of people who have been doing this for a lifetime. But you're saying, this kind of came out of this 2014 huge mobilization. So that's about like 5 years of organizing. What's kind of happened during that time? Like, what are the tactics that have been used to move this forward? Because, obviously I kind of live in a little bit of an environmental bubble, but like my Twitter feed is like blowing up with people like Bernie Sanders and all these other people talking about the CCPA. And obviously that's, this is this moment that you all have been building for a very long time. So how did you build up to, the date, a couple of days before the legislative session ending, this huge legislation is like, on the verge of passing? How did we get to this point?
Yeah. Lots of hard work. The coalition officially launched, I think, at the end of December 2015. And we started doing, listening, feedback sessions after the bill was already crafted in partnership with, a lot of our coalition members, with the legislature, with allied lawyers, to really come up with the actual bill language to work from. And so then we workshopped it in communities, tried to get more coalition members on board, and then had a really large mobilization on June 1st in 2016, which was the first year that the New York State Assembly passed the bill. And we had a couple hundred people from all across the state, from Buffalo to Brentwood, there, demonstrating and really validating the existence of this coalition, what we were fighting for, kind of understanding that the situation in the Senate was not going to allow us to get to a point, but really showing that the Assembly strongly had our backs, and that really uplifting the narratives of combining climate, jobs, and justice into a holistic framework for a just transition away from fossil fuels. And so since then, the coalition started off with 30 organizations, and now we're at 180. And that has looked in various communities very different, but the organizing has been about, direct outreach and communication, canvassing, flyering, public, mobilizing around public hearings, organizing town halls, political education workshops, having lobby days in Albany, doing call-in days, tabling, phone banking, and then just direct, again, through those is already in there, but direct engagement with community organizations and, allied grasstops leaders. And so, from the gambit of direct actions of civil disobedience to your, kind of milquetoast, call your legislators, we've built up a diverse 180 member coalition with tens of thousands of supporters across New York State.
Yeah, and so I know last week there was a lot of people in Albany. We're coming down to the wire with the end of the legislative session. There were some people who were, really, they were at Cuomo's doorstep. So we're going to hear a little bit from them. This is the people fighting for the CCPA in Albany last week, a week from today, on June 11th in Albany.
No! Repeat after me. Governor Cuomo. They can't hear you. Governor Cuomo. Governor Cuomo. Come on out. Governor Cuomo. Come on out.
My name is Rodney Rainey. I'm from Push Buffalo. Coordinator, I handle the hiring hall, and the goal is to teach everyone in this world about the CCPA. I want people to learn what I learned. I want people to learn about solar panels. I want people to learn about geothermal installation, lead installation. What we came here to do today is to teach people today that this world is important.
That's right.
We don't care if you wear suits.
Nope.
Y'all live on the same planet as us. And it don't make sense.
That's right.
Our goal is to teach and get training to the whole Buffalo and to the whole state of New York. I want y'all to see my face. See how far I came.
Right.
See what all these other people feel like. I want these people in suits to let them know and let us know that this is it.
Right.
This is for us. What the CCPA means to us and the people is that this is our solution. CCPA! 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 CCPA!
So that was the scene in Albany a week from today, or last week. And, you know, you had a whole hallway full of people calling on Governor Cuomo to support the CCPA because you have built up all this amazing organizing to get the state assembly on board, the state senate on board. So kind of where is the CCPA now, and how does Governor Cuomo fit into this whole position? Why was there, you know, a whole hallway full of people chanting on him to call out last week?
Yeah. Oof, what a loaded question. Yeah, so I mean, and I know you participated last year in April, the Cuomo Walk the Talk action, where we had over 1,000 people marching in the streets and over 40 people arrested. 55 people arrested for what we are seeing today, which is Cuomo talks a really good game and then undermines frontline grassroots-led solutions to create loopholes, caveats, and exemptions for his donors and allies in the fossil fuel industry. So he has never before this year wanted to codify any of his executive orders into law. Executive orders are great, but they're easy to make when only one decision maker has to do them. And what we saw with like the Clean Power Plan at the federal level is a new administration can come in and just eviscerate that. And so part of what we've been trying to do is codify into law some of the very similar goals to the governor, but with explicit targeted funding in disadvantaged communities and worker protections. He didn't want to see any of that. This year, during the budget negotiations in January, he introduced his own bill called the Climate Leadership Act, which is a severely watered down version of the Climate and Community Protection Act. While having like direct portions of CCPA copy and pasted into it, without having to that point publicly acknowledge the existence of our bill or of the coalition. And that's kind of his modus operandi. Pretend like he's the only one forwarding solutions. He's the only one with the answers. You know, frontline and community organizations don't know what they're doing. And so we've gotten to a point where, you know, the Assembly and Senate held really strong on not allowing the Climate Leadership Act to go through the budget negotiations, doing due diligence and working very closely with New Yorker News to finalize a strong bill that held to the core tenets. And in the final hours, here we are with a situation in which the Assembly and Senate agreed on bill language by the deadline of 12 a.m. or by Sunday night to not trigger, you know, this whole thing where the governor would have to issue this like necessity memorandum, there's whatever the legalese is, to like try to whittle away from control from him because the bill has to sit for 3 days before it can be voted on. And we saw their version of the bill and it was like very much aligned with ours. There was some changes to, rather than 40% of targeted investment, it was 35%. Cuomo wanted 0%. There were emission mandates for 85% of greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 with a very strong guardrails on a 15% carbon offsets program, which we got in there. And all of the labor standards. And now in the final version, which has been introduced as a program bill by the governor, because I guess that was part of the agreement that we weren't completely aware of at the time, there is now more ambiguous language around the 35% investment. The entire set of comprehensive labor standards have been taken out, only acknowledging utilizing prevailing wage for energy programs. But it was all tied into this other prevailing wage bill that's happening with more unions statewide, but like that actually doesn't seem to be happening. So that's now just like not in there. There's some nods to labor protections, but we had like conflict resolution and, you know, binding wage agreements and local hiring and workforce development, and none of that's in there anymore. And this is the governor just I can't believe I haven't already said this. He renamed it the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. So he just had to get the Climate Leadership Act lens framing into that just so people knew that it was his bill. It was his idea, even though this comprehensive, frontline-led, statewide grassroots coalition that had been fighting and cultivating and building the momentum to get to this point, in the final hour he comes in and swoops in so he can look like the hero, he can look like the champion, while creating carve-outs, while diluting the essence of what we're doing, while up until last week still referring to environmental justice communities in quotes, and insisting that money should go to where it's most environmentally needed. But apparently overburdened communities with air pollution suffering from respiratory illness, higher rates of cancer, don't qualify as that. And so I think we have an executive who pays lip service to issues of environmental justice, but actually perpetuates environmental racism.
Yeah, and we're definitely going to dig into that a lot more, because I think that's something that has always really separated the CCPA from other, legislation. But to be honest, like, just want to give a shout out to all this organizing that's been happening, because for weeks Governor Cuomo has been saying like, oh, there's not going to be any more climate legislation passed. We already dealt with that with this, he even co-opted the language of a Green New Deal for New York. And so just a lot of, props to the people that were outside his door. And, it's like you said, we were out there a year ago on April 23rd asking him to protect communities that are being harmed from frack gas infrastructure, and he locked his door on us and arrested us.
Yeah.
But he wouldn't arrest anybody last week.
Oh no, he refused. He didn't want to look bad. But he changed his tune. Like, again, he went from like climate is not in my top 10 priorities for the end of session as of early as 3 weeks ago to I don't want to have a political placebo in reference to CCPA, both saying that it is too ambitious and also wouldn't make a difference because he's already doing everything, to, saying that we shouldn't have targeted investment, to forcing him to, and also for the longest time, not actually wanting economy-wide mandates. So as is always the case, folks on the front lines who are fighting for justice have to pull decision makers into the correct lane. And we pulled someone who refused to do economy-wide emissions, who refused to acknowledge the necessity of targeted investment, to ultimately come up with a bill that sets really nation-leading emissions reductions timelines and has language in there specifically for frontline communities. And so he deserves almost no credit. And New Yorker News, the coalitions that make it up, and the partnership that we established, especially with the Assembly and the Senate, deserve credit for coming up with a bill that looks like what it is, and any part of it that is insufficient can be credited to the governor.
So you're listening to Revolutions Per Minute on listener-sponsored WBAI in New York City, broadcasting at 99.5 FM and streaming on all your favorite podcast apps. Today, we have Ryan Madden in the studio, and we are talking about climate justice in New York and these bills that we voted on any minute or tonight in the New York State Legislature. So I kind of want to dig in a little bit more on these environmental justice and equity provisions that, were kind of the very foundation of the CCPA and have been some of the most contentious points with the governor. And so the CCPA, the original bill, mandated 40% of clean energy funds to go to low-income communities. It has now been reduced to 35%. Why was this such an important part of the legislation to begin with? And maybe how do we continue to move that goal forward moving on?
Yeah, I mean, it was such a critical part of the legislation. One for deeply, moral and justice-oriented issues, and also just like pragmatic issues. Like 40%, I think 42% of New York State's population are people of color. 44% are low income. So it only makes sense that 40% of state climate funds should be invested in communities that represent a proportional demographic of the state, who also happen to bear the brunt of the externalities of fossil fuel production. So smokestacks, manufacturing, bus terminals, and so see increased rates of respiratory illness, asthma, cancers, heart disease in these communities. They should be at the front of the line for receiving the benefits of a new economy. And so that was a core tenet because it's what's rooted in the experience of those communities who have been organizing on the front lines for, again, decades. Uplifting the need for a just transition, uplifting the entire notion of environmental racism and its interconnections to housing issues and banking, and all of this is couched in structural racism perpetuated in this country. And so, like I said before, people closest to the problem are closest to the solutions, and let's empower and uplift those communities who know what they need but are just systematically barred from attaining what is their right. And so that was front and center because we've been a coalition led by environmental justice organizations and frontline communities, and that was the ask that they had. So we centered that, uplifted that, because again, we believe addressing climate change necessitates addressing economic inequality, structural racism, corporate power. And so if we don't have those solutions that are all paired together and a coalition with a broad base of people who share that analysis and are fighting for that, then we're actually not going to get to the root of what we need to do to address the climate crisis. You had a second question.
And so, I mean, what looks like it's going to pass isn't going to be the full ask and, what kind of justice demands. So how can we continue to implement these things and move them forward, moving on?
Yeah, I mean, with any piece of policy, like implementation is where the actual fight lies. Interestingly enough, like, the American Petroleum Institute came out after opposing this bill, as they're wont to do. The New York, Business Council did. But we didn't actually see a lot of like ads from, your traditional oil foes, because I think part of it is like, oh, here's where the political wins are, and what can we do later on in the process to make it really difficult, and that's an implementation. So the scoping plan outlined in the climate bill, the working groups that are being established, the benchmarking, the public hearings that will be set up through that, the program set up through the agencies. At every step of the process, that's where we need a broad base of grassroots support, fighting to maintain the investment in budget fights, maintaining the implementation from a programmatic lens, making sure that agencies like the DEC and NYSERDA are actually like cultivating these programs, successfully, promoting them, empowering community organizations, both financially and with other resources to actually implement them. And so find your nearest New Yorker News member in your community, nyrenews.org, and find out how they're relating to the implementation fight, because it's going to look different depending on what that organization is and where it is. People United for Sustainable Housing, Push Buffalo, have already been doing what the implementation work looks like with their School 77 project that has paired public housing with community solar and participatory budgeting. So there's already these examples, and we just need to, share best practices and, learn from what their organizing experience has been, so that now that this lever has been pulled where there's more, there's legal accountability, there's agency accountability, there's a kind of shift in logic and intention of these institutions. And so just having community-based organizations and grassroots support, drawing down resources to do what people have already done, just at the scale that we need.
Yeah, I mean, Push Buffalo is an organization we work a lot with at the Energy Democracy Alliance, and what they're doing in Buffalo is absolutely amazing. I mean, they're really training the community to build this energy. We hear, on a federal level about energy dominance is kind of Trump's like line, right? And that's just, capitalism in energy of, extracting from this community, they pay all the prices while some rich white man makes all the money. And then what we see is pushed is these communities where they're actually training people to build solar in their own communities. And then the community owns the energy. And that's what energy, the opposite of energy dominance is energy democracy. Yeah. And that's, it's really exciting. And how do we make sure that happens, not just in, a small radius in Buffalo, but all over the state. And I think that's really exciting. And we're going to briefly actually go to a clip of some work that the Eco-Socialist Working Group is working on here in New York City as part of their public power campaign to take on Con Ed, who is, one of the kind of power brokers in our energy system right now. They want to raise our rates in their local hearing, and there'll be some public hearing coming up. So I talked to Amber with the Eco-Socialist Working Group about what's coming up with the Con Ed rate case. And here's Amber.
Con Ed is proposing a rate hike, which means we'll all be paying more money on our monthly bills. Why is Con Ed raising our rates?
So Con Edison is seeking to raise rates for electricity by 6% and gas by 11%. If you get both your gas and electricity from Con Ed, you're going to see your utility bill increase by around $20 a month. The only opportunity that ratepayers have to fight against this rate increase is at the public hearings, which will be on June 26th at 3 p.m. and 7 p.m. at 90 Church Street in Manhattan. Usually these public hearings are not very public, and the Public Service Commission just rubber stamps everything Con Ed requests. The Public Service Commission is a 5-person board appointed by Governor Cuomo, and there's definitely a revolving door between the Cuomo administration and Con Ed's board of directors. They rarely hold Con Ed accountable, and even when people are killed in gas explosions, they're hesitant to fine Con Ed because they know they'll just pass the costs on to ratepayers. We declared the Eco-Socialist Working Group as a party in this rate case, and we're trying to turn out as many people as possible to this public hearing to fight against Con Ed squeezing even more profits out of a service that should be guaranteed as a right. We also want to use this opportunity to fight against the massive build-out of unneeded fossil fuel infrastructure they're proposing, like the Williams Pipeline and the liquefied natural gas plant in Astoria. Private utilities are monopolies, and they're actually guaranteed a rate of return on investment of around 9 to 10% no matter what. The profit motive has incentivized them to slow the transition to renewable energy, push natural gas, limit energy efficiency, and inflate the base of their investments by building infrastructure we don't even need. They've doubled infrastructure investments in the last decade, even though energy demand has been flat since 2008. They're also basing their depreciation schedules for these investments on the premise that we'll still be using this fossil fuel infrastructure in 2085 and 2105, which we know would be ecocidal. Their entire business model is based on investing in assets that will either become stranded or create a future that will be unlivable for most New Yorkers, externalizing all of the costs of pollution and climate change onto us.
Why does DSA oppose this rate hike?
Con Ed already charges the second highest residential rates of any major utility in the country, 25 cents per kilowatt hour, which is nearly double the national average. Con Ed also has a very high fixed charge, meaning they charge around $20 a month regardless of how much energy you use. That charge is regressive, and it disincentivizes energy efficiency and solar ownership. Con Ed doesn't need more money. They already make over $1 billion in profits each year. They pay millions for lobbyists and astroturfing campaigns to slow the transition to renewable energy. They pay their CEO a $9 million salary. And they want to create a $1.6 million strike contingency fund to union bust and prevent workers from fighting back if management tries to cut their healthcare and pension benefits again. All of that money could be redirected towards making our energy system cleaner, safer, and more reliable if the grid were publicly owned and democratically controlled, which is what our public power campaign is ultimately advocating for.
And why should people even attend these public hearings?
This public hearing is one of the only opportunities we have to hold Con Ed accountable and bring some democracy to our energy system. We really encourage everyone to come out to the public hearing, air your grievances, and share personal stories of how high energy bills, Con Ed's negligence, or pollution have affected you. The PSC rarely hears from the real people that their decisions affect, so we're hoping to show them the human costs of high energy bills. We can host an info session prior to the hearings to answer questions and get you prepared for testimony. So here are the times and location for the upcoming public hearings. There will be 2 public statement hearings with 2 time slots each for Con Ed's rate case. The first set of hearings will be in Yonkers on June 25th, and the second set of hearings will be in Manhattan on June 26th. The first hearing on Tuesday, June 25th, will be at the Grinton I. Will branch of the Yonkers Public Library, which is at 1500 Central Park Avenue. There will be info sessions at 1 p.m. and 6 p.m., and public hearings will begin at 2 p.m. and 7 p.m. The info sessions are just going to be Con Ed's executives giving a PowerPoint on what's in the rate case, so you don't have to attend the info sessions in order to testify. The second hearing on Wednesday, June 26th, will be at the New York State Department of Public Service, which is located at 90 Church Street in Manhattan in the boardroom on the 4th floor. There will be info sessions at 2 p.m. and 6 p.m., followed by public hearings at 3 p.m. and 7 p.m. Since the PSC hearing on the 26th is on the same night as the first primary debate, and the PSC isn't likely to hold Con Ed to the standards we'd like them to, we also worked with Councilmember Constantinides to organize the City Council Town Hall, where you will be able to provide testimony for the record. This town hall will be in Astoria in mid-July, and it's where we're going to be focusing most of our mobilizing efforts. Astoria produces half the city's energy and has some of the most polluting infrastructure, which motivated us to hold the town hall there. Plus, the Astoria Borealis was a great example of Con Ed neglecting the grid until something exploded, or arc flashed. We highly encourage DSA members to come out to that. As always, if you have any questions or would like to get plugged in, you can email us at climate@socialists.nyc.
And you're listening to Revolutions Per Minute on listener-sponsored WBAI in New York City, broadcasting at 99.5 FM and streaming on all your favorite podcast apps. If you want to get more involved in the campaign you just heard about, the Con Ed rate case and the Public Power NYC, you can go to publicpower.nyc.com. And very soon we're going to be opening up the phone lines to everybody listening to hear from you what you want to see as far as climate legislation, your own energy impacts, things like that. But before we open up, Ryan, I want to talk a little bit about some of the work that you've been doing out in Long Island to get, places of worship to convert to renewable energy. We heard some great clips from Push Buffalo that's really doing a lot of work to get solar on buildings and it to be a community thing. So can you just talk a little bit about this vision of communities actually building their own renewable energy?
Yeah, so we have been working with nonprofit organizations and houses of worship to develop solar projects on Long Island. These types of organizations face very particular barriers, high upfront costs, inability to take advantage of tax credits, multiple levels of decision making, unfamiliarity with the technology. And so what we've done is created a program to lower costs by aggregating projects together, bringing in third-party financing who can actually monetize the tax credits and pass on the savings, and then doing a deep trust building, relationship building, and hand-holding throughout the entire process to facilitate them through all of the messy processes to get solar installed. And what we've seen in our first bundle is that it just makes such a huge difference. One of the biggest projects we've done was the First Baptist Church of Riverhead, a 56 kilowatt project where now they're saving $15,000 a year. And they're a deeply involved community-based church, so they have, education programs. They work with local prison population. They have food services. They have community events. So now they have more resources to invest in their own community. And they came together through a crowdfunding to be able to pay for a portion of the solar, and then worked with a local bank. And they had tried for 10 years to go solar and couldn't until our program met all of their needs. And so we've seen that it meets not only their needs, as institutions that have been kind of left behind in the renewable economy, but that these organizations are primed not only because they have the space, but they have the intention, the community, and the groundedness in community to be anchor sites for community solar, where we can develop projects where the membership of these institutions, this church, this synagogue, this mosque, can be the direct owners and benefit directly from a system that is in their community, that is demonstrating to others in their community that they can do this too. So we're having some really exciting conversations with some nonprofit organizations for some large-scale projects to offset like 30 of their staff members' electricity bills. And so, yeah, we're just trying to get it off the ground. A lot of complications in solar policy. Long Island has its own utility, so it's always a little bit behind in terms of adopting certain provisions. So we're just getting started, but we want every single house of worship on Long Island to have solar on it and to be owned and controlled by the members of those groups.
It's really exciting stuff. And if you're listening and you want your community to be able to do this, call in. Let us know what you want to see solarized in your own community. Also, if you have thoughts about the legislation that's being passed or the vision of where we want to go in New York State, give us a call. The number is 212-209-2877. Again, that number is 212-209-2877. And yeah, let us know, what do you want to solarize in your own community? And, while we're waiting for callers, Ryan, I kind of want to talk a little bit about, too, this legislation that's been worked on for, that stands on the shoulders of decades of organizing, has been really happening here in New York with the CCPA. Is this a good kind of model for what we should be doing with a Green New Deal on that level? I know you do some organizing with Sunrise, or what parts of this can we maybe extrapolate on a national level and should be working towards?
Yeah, I mean, I think, a lot of tensions emerged, in the dialogue around the Green New Deal. But really, the points of unity, the principles that inform New Yorker News, and the actual legal language that we crafted with the Climate and Community Protection Act is exactly what we need to be doing at a national level. Combining climate policy with worker protections, investment in directly impacted communities, and fostering community empowerment in the transition. It's one of the most perfect models, I think, and actually has been used. Bernie Sanders introduced legislation a few years ago that directly took the definition of disadvantaged communities from the Climate and Community Protection Act. So I think we are, a couple years ahead of the curve about what a bold, unapologetically progressive and ambitious climate bill could look like when you very thoughtfully incorporate labor protections, labor rights, and the priorities and needs of environmental justice communities. Scale that up, do it even better, make sure that we have a president willing to enact it that is not Governor Cuomo, for many reasons. But yeah, I think this serves as a model, and even though there's some shortcomings in the ultimate outcome document, it really validates the power that we've built through this coalition to move intractable politicians, and we just got to keep cracking down that wall, and lead with vision, lead with values, and centering equity and community empowerment at all times.
Yeah, so a note to AOC, keep Cuomo out of the policy. We have a listener on the line now. You are live on WBAI.
Yes, hi. I know that solar is basically people figure out the roof, but I'm a renter, and I rent with 3 other people, and our rooms have terraces. So I was wondering, if I can incorporate solar on a room basis and put panels on the terrace, which I face the east, and I get a lot of sun, and basically hook it up to a battery, a lithium battery type of situation with one of those converters that convert it back to AC, so that it could be a kind of a modular thing. And my landlord is very pro solar and very environmentally conscious, but he doesn't, he can't do the roof. So I was wondering, is that a possibility as far as doing it on a room by room level, where, I could be independent as far as my computer usage of energy, and also my, the limited amount of lighting I use and things like that, because I don't need that much.
Sure. Yeah, this is Ryan. Thanks for that question. It's great that you've given so much thought to, how can you figure this out for yourself? I obviously don't know exactly what your building looks like or how that's situated. My initial gut reaction is look into a community solar array that might already be established in your community. If you just Google community solar in my neighborhood, there's a website through the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority that will let you know what company has already built a community array in your surrounding area that you can just become a subscriber to and help offset the amount you're paying per month without having to physically install it yourself. That's community solar allows renters to access that type of program. And if you don't see something like that, rather than, if there are limitations on your roof, then organize, people in your building or in your surrounding community to identify a place where you could have an array. Like a local church or mosque or synagogue, a nonprofit organization, a municipal building, or a private building with someone that you might have a relationship with or think you could move them. So yeah, rather than bending over backwards to figure that out just for yourself, I would recommend either just joining an existing community solar array or organizing with other people to expand access for other folks in your building.
Yeah, and then one other really exciting kind of proposal for New York, and this similar thing as we're envisioning where we put solar is, Council Member Constantinides, who, is working with DSA to have a good hearing on the Con Ed rate case, has also proposed to put solar on Rikers Island. So, I love this vision of us thinking, where has, the most harm been done? Where has, environmental justice taken, just really hurt people, and envisioning this new thing. So it's a really cool thing to just start looking around where we live and being oh, this has been a very terrible place. How do we convert this to be something that benefits everybody? And we do have another caller on the line. You are now live on WBAI.
Hello?
Yep, we can hear you.
Hi, great. So we're kind of ignoring the elephant in the room. Are you familiar with geoengineering?
Yes, definitely. And in the Con Ed rate case, we're talking a lot about how we don't build more frac gas infrastructure. Oh, you're talking about geoengineering in the sky, not geothermal. Sorry.
Yeah,
I was a little off.
The intentional use of particulate matter to block out the sun's rays and move the jet stream. I'm sure you don't produce the energy that is needed on a cloudy day as on a sunny day. And if every day or almost every day over our heads, tankers at 60,000 feet are spraying particulate matter and blocking out the sun.
So
what are we going to do about that?
Sorry, I just want to be clear on where you're coming from. Are you saying should we be exploring geoengineering solutions, or you already think that geoengineering is happening and we need to address that?
Excuse me. Yeah, 100% is happening. I mean, and anybody with eyes can see the tankers on a daily basis spraying the particulate matter out of the back. It's not a contrail. It's not steam vapor. It's a special mixture of aluminum and barium and different things to create cloud canopies, which are blocking our sun. Today's weather is all artificially created. If you go to geoengineeringwatch.org, you'll see the sad truth of what's happening. I mean, it's great to have solar panels, but if they're blocking out our sun, the industry is going to come to a dead end.
I'd lean into your frustrations with the government and the nefarious things that they do towards building working class power, rather than I don't know how to respond without saying that I don't think that's happening. The government does incredibly harmful, awful, terrible things. I don't trust them to do most things, but I don't think they're doing that. And so let's focus on climate solutions from the front lines.
Yeah, and I think that's a really perfect segue into kind of the way we like to wrap up the show is what can people do to get more involved? We heard from the Eco-Socialist Working Group that Con Ed is going to be having public hearings very soon on the rate case. That's one thing people can do on a very localized level right here in New York City to say, hey, don't raise my bill so that you can build more pipelines. That's going to be happening on June 26th at 90th Church Street at 3 p.m. and 7 p.m. But how can can people get more involved? And, you know, in addition to the CCPA, there's a whole nother bill that you'll be organizing for next year, the Climate and Community Investment Act. So last word, Ryan, what can people do to continue to fight for climate justice in New York?
Yeah, well, quickly, I think we should, think that just preempt the whole situation and just rename it Cuomo's Climate and Community Investment Act. So we just skip that whole thing. I really encourage folks. New Yorker News is, this powerhouse coalition that has been working and got us to this finish line on a really comprehensive climate bill. We're building out a more of a campaign for the Climate and Community Investment Act, which would levy a fee on corporate polluters and use the billions of dollars of revenue to invest in community and worker transition programs. So if you go to nyrenews.org, you can check out how to get involved, how to get on our email list. We're obviously at the last day of the session, so we're going to breathe for a little bit before figuring out how we go about fighting for the CCIA to fund this transition on the community's terms. But in the meantime, just check us out, learn about us, see, we have a great coalition map of organizations. So find out what groups are in your backyards that you can build with. Just start having conversations with your neighbors, faith leaders in your community about what sites could be good options for community solar, and start local fundraising campaigns or find out about grant programs to institute these things. You don't have to wait to be told to do these things by other people. We can just do it ourselves.
Awesome. And thanks so much for being on. And thanks everybody for listening to Revolutions Per Minute on WBAI in New York City, broadcasting at 99.5. And we'll catch you next week, every Tuesday at 5 p.m.